Okay, now we're going to move into actual historical events that occurred through the colonial encounters between the different European countries and the tribes of what is now known as the United States. We've seen this map before. I just wanted to show it to you again. Um, this shows what is currently known as the United States. And zoom in to the southwest here. As you can see, it has the borders here. These borders did not exist, obviously. So a lot of these tribes extended upwards into the Canada regions, and then the tribes down in the southern regions extended out into Mexico too. So those are arbitrary lines that are put onto this map, but it's a good depiction of, it shows you the different tribal cultural areas that existed prior to contact. So when you read the textbook, The Rights of Indians and India. So when you read the textbook, The Rights of Indians and Tribes, there are 7 federal Indian policy eras that are described by PVAR. And we will be talking about the first 2 federal Indian policy eras. That is tribal independence and agreements between equals. We want to talk about the historical antecedents to colonialism and subjugation in the United States. We have to look all the way back to the Romans and how they would take over different lands in the old world and impose their governance and settle on those lands. And so basically this concept of territorium nullium, which is basically states empty land. And so it's a Roman law that allowed for the armies to subjugate people by conquest, and the people that they subjugated were considered heathens. And so this was the early practice of colonialism. After the discovery, and I say that with quotes, discovery of the Americas, different theological scholars saw what was happening and some of the atrocities that occurred. Thomas Aquinas and Pope Innocent IV decreed that the indigenous peoples of the Americas should be peacefully integrated into Christianity and not violently subjugated. The papal bulls addressed the New World, so Pope Alexander VI granted lands to Spain and Portugal. So if you look at the lands, there's a dividing line. So where Brazil is at, that's where Portugal got granted the land, and then the rest of the lands in Mexico and in southern South America, Central America, were granted to Spain. And Francis de Vitoria suggested that indigenous people had inherent sovereign powers. And so he was a very important advocate for indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. People were not viewed as real human beings. Okay, so here's the decree of 1537, and it states that indigenous people are true men. It opposes the common practice of enslavement and deprivation of land. And so, and this arrived from a lot of the reports back to the church about some of the atrocities that were happening. They were, the colonizers were killing people, feeding them to the dogs. There's rape, torture, and murder. Some of the indigenous people committed suicide in order to invade the cruelty of the invaders. Captains of slave ships would navigate following the trail of dead cast overboard by the ships ahead of them. So entire populations of people were annihilated by both disease and genocide. And people that weren't immune to disease didn't make good slaves, and this set the stage for the African slave trade. And so here is the decree by Pope Paul in 1537. We talked a little bit about Victoria. So he declared that American Indian people are true owners of the land, and Europeans had no right to the land based on discovery. So before then, it was viewed that any Christian that went to a land where the people were not Christian, that those people did not have rights to their land. Only Christian people had rights of title to the land. Victoria said no, that isn't true, and that the people should not be treated like that. So he was one of the first advocates for American Indian rights. And what he argued against was the doctrine of discovery, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Treaties were established between Britain and the various tribes. There were also treaties with the Netherlands and the different tribes up there in the New York area. And so the United States practiced the treaty making. They carried on that practice that the British had been engaging in previously. It was a formal recognition of the government-to-government relationship, and often exchanged lands for goods and also protection. The United States would guarantee protection of tribes and tribal land from settlers and from Europeans that were coming into the continent. So it created that set-aside area for the tribes to function as sovereign nations. So basically, from the time that the United States was established until 1828, treaties were still being entered into, and there was a lot of settlement and a lot of immigrants coming into the new colonies and the states of the United States. And so the Congress had a task of controlling that and making sure that the treaties were being adhered to, which all of the time were broken. So there was not one treaty that was actually upheld over the course of time. And so history tells us that while the treaties weren't honored, they still established the sovereignty of the tribes, and that's an enduring thing today. And so we're going to talk about, in the next lecture, we'll talk about the Indian removal and relocation.